Hi. Oh, that's terrible. I was going to shout obscenities for a few minutes. Are you guys enjoying your LayerOne so far? Thank you, cameraman. Okay, so I'm sure you've heard this already, but for those who haven't, all the contests are live. You have Capture the Flag, Deobfuscation, Tamper Evident Contest. This is the last talk of the day, so after this, we're going to close this room to flip it over for our banquet dinner and party later on. If you're looking for something to do in between now and then, or after this talk and then, we have the demo party beginning in the chill out room. It's like a fun little programming contest that a couple people are participating in, so go see the fruits of their labors. If you're participating in ham testing, that's at 1800 in the lockpicking village, so be there around that time if that's your thing. At 7, we're going to have like a pre-dinner, pre-game, I guess is the best way to describe it. So if you got a hotel room, come see me and you will get a magical wristband which gives you free beer for an hour, so get really drunk because after that I have to pay for it. So that'll be at 7 right out here. We'll have appetizers for everybody as well. At 8 we have dinner starting. So dinner is a big banquet with lots of different kinds of food. We also have a live band who should be starting around 8:30, 8:45 after you guys have all eaten. And then we have casino night. So if you're unfamiliar, you should be dressing nice, very swanky. Maybe talk like a 1940s detective, say. It's up to you really how you play casino night. But coming up next, we have Sean Malone with Planning Effective Red Team Exercises. Give him a big hand.
Thank you. Bit of background on where I'm coming from here. About a little bit over 10 years in offensive information security, everything from web apps, network, physical, social, and so on. Last 4 years of that have been with FusionX doing adversary simulation, which is essentially a deeply technical red team exercise combined with threat intelligence and business intelligence as well. My primary focus at this point within FusionX is on the design of these attack campaigns, though I've worn a lot of different hats in the time there. Just background on FusionX for those who may not be aware. FusionX as a company is about almost 6 years old at this point. I joined as the first non-founding employee and worked with them to grow the company from 2 people up to 25 people at the point that we were acquired by Accenture last August. So as an overview of the different types of technical security assessments here, because these terms are used in many different ways across the industry. So first, just to level set, I see essentially 3 categories here when we talk about finding vulnerabilities in an enterprise environment. You have your vulnerability assessment, which is usually automated, scanning very broadly across, ideally, all of your information assets on a regular basis. You're looking to find technical vulnerabilities so that they can be remediated. Next is the penetration test, where you're going beyond the automated scanning and actually manually investigating for vulnerabilities, doing some degree of chaining vulnerabilities together to get from one step to the next. So you're looking not just at that first layer of defense, but also at attack surfaces that only get exposed after you've already breached that first layer. A red team exercise is essentially a penetration test on steroids, in that we are doing elements of penetration testing, but it's blended together in the form of a coordinated attack campaign. So with the red team exercise, we're really looking at the overall ability to prevent, detect, and respond to an attack by a relatively sophisticated adversary. So our objective here is that we're looking to achieve what the adversary's objective would be without detection, or if that detection occurs, to then spar with the responding security operations team and seek to evade their attempts to eradicate us from the network. We'll go into these various other elements throughout the talk here. So taking a deeper dive on the objectives here, it depends on which perspective we're looking at this from. From the red team's perspective, we're looking to accurately simulate what that sophisticated adversary would be doing. What is it that they're looking to achieve? How would they go about doing that? What are the starting points, and what are realistic attack campaigns that would get them from point A to point B? The end goal then is to achieve what the client considers to be a nightmare scenario without detection and eradication. And finally, we're looking to demonstrate business impact. So a board member may not know what a domain controller is or the impact of having access to a domain administrator account, but they will certainly understand what it means if you can initiate unauthorized wire transfers out of a financial institution. On the client side, they're looking to understand their attack resiliency. If we were attacked today, how prepared are we to prevent, detect, and respond? They use those results then to drive risk reduction by prioritizing investments in different areas of their security program. So this is measuring the effectiveness of their security program, which is a different question from measuring the maturity of different processes and teams, from measuring alignment with standards. It's possible to have something that on paper looks good, but when you go out and actually attack this organization, you find that the pieces aren't fitting together as they should be, and there are some gaps in the effectiveness of the program. And finally, it's to provide a sparring partner for the security operations team. So ideally, when the security operations team undergoes a real attack and they're forced to respond to that, you don't want this to be the first attack that they've experienced. So the way that we'll structure this is to attack our clients on a regular basis, usually once a quarter, and their security operations team doesn't know when we're coming, what type of attack we'll be using, and so they respond to every one of these attacks as if it is a real attack by a malicious adversary. This means that when that day comes and they're forced to respond to that malicious attack, this is something that they've drilled on at least once a quarter for the last several years. So they have a playbook, they know what the rules are, they know what tools they have and how to use them, and they know how to prevent, detect, and respond in their enterprise. So in order to achieve these objectives, we're looking to plan for success. So this talk is focused on how do we plan for success? What are the principles that go into this design, into the design of these red team exercises, and then what are the considerations for the different components of the exercise? So first, the foundational principles. The first and perhaps the most important is hyperrealism. This means that if there is an attack technique that's available to the real adversary, that should be available to your red team. If the real adversary can drop USBs in the parking lot, that's a legitimate attack technique. If they can physically walk into your building wearing a fast food delivery uniform and plug something in on the internal network, that's a legitimate attack technique. If they can use elements of social engineering, wireless, and so on, all of those should be in scope. Is the security operations team going to know when a real attack is going to commence? Usually not. So again, a corollary to that hyperrealism is this zero knowledge and zero notice. Zero knowledge refers to the information that the red team has, which is ideally zero. So when we go through these exercises, we'll tell our team delivering the attack simulation, here's your target and here's your objective. This is what you're looking to do, and here are any specific rules of engagement that have been negotiated with the target. But they're not informed anything about the systems that contain the type of information or the types of applications that they're targeting. They're not told anything about the IP addresses or detailed information about the target's environment. They're certainly not told anything about the security controls that the client enterprise has in place. So they're attacking and probing their way through this and needing to discover this information as they go along in the same way that a real adversary would. Similarly, zero notice. We charter these at the executive level, and nobody below that level knows that this attack is going to occur, much less when it's going to occur or the techniques that will be used. So we want to ensure that not only do the team that has eyes on glass watching the detection tools, that they're not aware of it, but also that the people responsible for prioritization of their initiatives are not aware of it as well. Because we've had cases where there's not that segregation of the information about the assessment, and a detection occurs, and normally it would be responded to in one way or another, but because the director of the security operations team is aware of the exercise, his direction of that team taints the response in some way, so you lose some of that realism. And then finally, perhaps a very obvious one, do no harm. If there's something that would have any negative impact to the client's ability to operate or would otherwise harm the organization, that needs to be something that's out of bounds. So there is, to some degree, a tension between the hyper-realism and the do no harm in some cases. And so that's a line that you'll need to walk in close coordination with the target enterprise. Because we will, for example, have clients that authorize us to steal $500,000 by initiating a wire transfer out of the organization with the understanding that we're then going to transfer it back when we're done. So it is possible to have the hyperrealism while doing no harm. So key considerations to walk through here. The first is the adversary scenario, how to design this and then plan out the attack campaign to achieve that objective, how to scope these engagements, the rules of engagement to establish, and then the communication and escalation plan. So for the adversary scenario, we're looking for something at the business level. This is going to be highly industry specific and specific even to the individual client. What is it that they care about? What are their nightmare scenarios? Who would want to cause those nightmare scenarios in terms of classes of threat actors in the world? Why? What motivates those threat actors? What's the impact if the threat actors achieve their objectives? What are those specific objectives then in terms of what are the business systems that the adversary will need to access in order to achieve their broader goals? And what's their starting point? Is this an international crime ring that has the ability to place agents physically at the target's corporate headquarters in order to walk into the building? Or is it something where the attacks need to be entirely remote? Do they have the ability to establish a legitimate business relationship with the target and then use that to open up a new attack surface? So again, we have clients that will ask us to go through this process of identifying, can we register a shell company as a vendor or as a customer of their organization in order to get credentialed access to an additional attack surface and then probe that attack surface. So we've seen commercial banking applications where the front door is very robust, but once you have credentials, there were various authorization problems such that you could run a report that would give financial details for any user of that application. So be mindful of what creative attack vectors might be there to allow you as a simulated adversary to have access to a broader attack surface without being granted anything for the purposes of doing this assessment. It's very different when somebody at the organization hands you credentials because you're doing a security assessment, and when you, as a simulated adversary, go create a shell company, create this legitimate business relationship between the shell company and the target organization, and then use that relationship to attack the target organization. For the first one, there's always going to be a naysayer in the organization who says, well, yes, but you only did this because you had credentials. And you only had those because we gave them to you. In the second one, you've demonstrated that this is something that anybody with sufficient dedication and creativity could pull off. So some of the concerns that the client may have and suggestions for working through them. The first one may be that I need to check the boxes for certain types of assessments. I have regulations that require me to do a network penetration test and an application penetration test. If this is structured and chartered properly, you can help your clients check those boxes while doing it in the context of this type of assessment. So will an attack simulation involve a penetration test against their external network? Yes, they can check that box, and so on. Another concern is simply that they feel that they're not a target for this type of attack. And more, this one is going away because we've seen that if you are a target, then you're a target. If you're a Home Depot, etc. Even if you are not engaged in information as your primary business, there is nonetheless information that would be valuable to the adversaries. Some things that we try to avoid when chartering these projects is first, only defining IT objectives. So this sometimes requires working with the executives on the client side to educate them about how this is different from a penetration test. We'll have them occasionally say, we want to give you a list of systems or flags, and your job is to go get those flags. If we do that, we're losing the realism, though. We've had cases where a client wants us to do that, but what we find is that they say get access to system A. When we get in, we breach the perimeter, we're moving around in the environment, we find that we actually have access to system B, which according to most metrics seems to be more valuable to the adversary than system A. And that's what we're looking to go after then, is system B. We don't want to bang our head against a wall trying to get to this one IT system when we can actually do more simulated damage by going after another system. So that's why we want to keep it at the business level objectives. Similarly, avoid dilution of effort. We'll have clients ask us to go after a half dozen targets in a fairly short period of time. And what this translates to is you're then simulating a half dozen, say, 1 week attacks instead of one 6-week attack. And usually it's that 1 6-week attack targeting a single very damaging objective that's really going to have a negative material impact on the organization. So we'll coach our clients to focus more on going deep instead of broad for this specific type of assessment. You want to be broad in your vulnerability assessments. You want to be broad in your penetration testing. But when it comes to the red team exercise, you're really looking for depth because you're looking to test all of those different layers of the security program. So then when you're designing the campaign plan to achieve those objectives, we want to be creative, be adaptive, and be resilient. So we've gone some into the creativity in terms of what are all of the possible different ways, the possible different attack surfaces that might get you closer to your objective. Being adaptive comes in the sense that we don't know when we start the engagement what direction it's going to take. We may have 4 or 5 different starting points, but we don't know which of those is actually going to yield access to the next layer back in the organization. And we'll have clients who ask us up front, I'd like to see your detailed attack plan. I'd like to know day by day what you're going to be doing. We can't work with clients who require that. And we have to either not do work with them or coach them towards understanding that we don't know in week 1 what we're going to be doing in week 4. We don't know if it's going to be easier for us to probe the external network and find a WordPress site that has some vulnerable plugins running an outdated kernel, and we'll start snowballing from there. Or perhaps their network perimeter looks pretty solid, but the physical security at their corporate headquarters is pretty weak, and we can walk in and plug something in under a conference table that has a cellular modem in it, and we'll bypass that entire perimeter in that manner. And so because of that, We want to maintain that ability to be adaptive as we go along. We need to be resilient as well, and this goes into the detection and response component, in that once we get any sort of foothold on the network, our first priority is maintaining the access that we have before continuing on. So this goes into all of the OPSEC principles of first being as stealthy as possible and being as redundant as possible. So if we have access to 2 different workstations, we want to ensure that those workstations are beaconing out to separate command and control systems using separate protocols, separate intervals, but ideally even separate persistence techniques and payloads on those workstations, so that one of those can be detected and contained, eradicated from the network, and we still have the other one in their environment that, because it's using a different profile, different TTPs, detection and eradication of the one is not going to immediately result in detection and eradication of the other. And we use this at every step as we go along. Once we have access to the internal network and start probing further, one of our next objectives will be to compromise enough systems to stand up a layer of proxies that will have our patient 0 on the network, and then have, if we've found switches with default credentials on them, we'll create SSH tunnels from patient 0 out to those LayerOne proxies, and then go through those tunnels to additional devices that form layer 2, and through those to layer 3. And then we'll use traffic exiting our shadow network at those layer 3 proxies in order to then target the systems that we care about. This means that when we have any suspicion that an attack has occurred, we're seeing, or that a detection of our attack has occurred, such as we get kicked off of a system that we have access to, a password changes out of the normal rotation and unexpectedly, whatever may occur there, we can then burn certain layers of proxies and blacklist those so that we're never using those again. This makes our efforts to move through the environment very difficult to trace back to that patient 0 unless you have very robust network traffic logging capabilities, even internal to your network. So all of that goes into being resilient so that you can withstand attempts by the security operations team to detect and respond to this type of an intrusion. So again, client concerns and some things to avoid here. We'll have clients that object to our creativity, saying that I don't think I can approve a physical breach of the environment, or we know that someone will click the link, why are we testing that? So if they don't think they can approve a certain type of attack, that means you're not operating high enough in the environment or in the organization. So like I mentioned, most of our projects are chartered at the executive level. So it's whoever is responsible for answering to the board, are we ready? That's usually the CISO, CIO, occasionally the CFO or a chief risk officer if there is one for the organization. So it's somebody who has sufficient authority to authorize the full use of that creativity. This concern about knowing that someone will click the link is a pretty common one, because when people think of phishing assessments or using phishing as a technique, they usually have in mind a picture of sending out 100 emails in a relatively untargeted fashion across the employee base and seeing how many people click the link. That's not what we're testing here. We agree, someone will click the link. What we're looking to do is send out 1 or 2 perfectly crafted emails with the perfect scenario and the perfect payload. Sometimes that's paired with picking up the phone and calling someone. Sometimes we'll establish rapport first and send emails back and forth, maybe 3 or 4 emails back and forth before actually sending the payload, so that the target feels like there's this relationship established. What this means is that when we get code execution on a system, that's essentially our starting point. We're interested in what happens next. Can we get, well, so first, if somebody clicks the link, can we get the payload to the system? Can we execute that payload on the system? If we execute that payload, is it detected? How hard is it to achieve persistence on that system? And how hard is it to cloak that persistence so that we can use that as a pivot point into the environment over a period of 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? Because we will have engagements that go that long. So at that point, you're looking at the detection and response, not the human layer. It's an admission that the human layer will always fail if you are persistent enough and creative enough. So that alone is not going to be enough. What happens next? Things that we want to avoid are fragmented offensive campaigns. And this is where you have the creativity to think of all of these different attack vectors, but they're not really woven together as one. So, and again, going back to the hyperrealism, we want to avoid being granted any form of access. So if we're doing an internal attack campaign, we're only doing that after we've successfully breached the external network and have established that persistent presence. The goal is to be able to tell the story end to end. I started as an adversary with zero information and zero access, and I got to the point where I was able to achieve what you consider to be a nightmare scenario. So that's a very compelling story, and will often give the clients what they need to be able to really improve their security programs. And as I mentioned, we want to avoid overly specific plans. We can talk hypothetically when we start out about the high-level stages that we're going to go through, but we don't know the specifics. We don't know exactly what path this is going to take. For the scope of the assessment, we want to think globally and strike precisely. This means that we want to consider the entirety of the organization. Our scope is the enterprise. So again, sometimes clients who are thinking more in terms of penetration testing will say, well, these are the systems that I care about. I want to limit my scope to those. But that's not what we're looking at here, because the systems that you know to be your high-value assets, which may be a particular set of a dozen systems, or it may be a given site, a given data center. You consider this to be your high-value asset. You are naturally going to pay more attention to securing what you consider to be your high-value asset. So if you attack that head-on as the adversary, it's less likely to be successful. However, if you have this branch office that contains nothing that is considered to be a high-value asset, and so its physical security is lower, and someone can walk in there and put something on the network, but you can then move laterally from that to a given number of systems, and those systems have a vulnerability that let you pivot from there to other points in the network, and those other points in the network have vulnerable servers that allow you to execute code at an administrative level and compromise domain credentials, and then use those domain credentials to target the high-value assets. That's much harder to guard against. And so that's usually going to be the path of least resistance for the adversary. So we want to think globally in terms of considering every possible asset, but then strike precisely. And what this means is that every action that we take is done with the attitude of, does this get me closer to the end objective? We'll have times when relatively new members to our team will identify a vulnerability and compromise a system. They got a shell on the box, and they'll be very excited about it, and a little bit disappointed when we say, so what? We already had credentials that give us an equivalent level of access to what you just got through exploiting this vulnerability. And when you exploit that vulnerability, you increase the risk of detection by the security operations team. So every action is a risk-reward evaluation. How much does this increase my risk of detection and response by the SecOps team? And does this get me something that I did not have before? getting closer to the end objective. We won't always know as we spider out from our initial point of compromise through the network which techniques and which steps will and will not pay off. But we will know that, say, we had access to the network but did not have a user account on the domain. So we want a user account on the domain. Then we want an account that will allow us administrative access to at least some servers. Okay, then we have that. Then we need administrative access to some workstations. So we'll keep building these blocks as we go along, striking precisely at each proximate goal so that we can then build our arsenal and be able to have all of the tools in our pocket to then target our end objective of the systems in the given line of business that we're targeting. An example of how this plays out in a real attack would be that once we have access to a system that has administrative rights on most workstations in the environment, we were targeting a financial institution, and the goal was what I mentioned earlier, of actually transfer money out of the organization. So through looking at the groups, we could identify which users were members of money movement Active Directory groups. We go out and target the workstations for those users and simply sit on those workstations for a week and watch in terms of screen captures, keystroke logs, and so on, looking at what they're doing. Their standard Mimikatz types of tricks get us the credentials for those users as well, and we watch their email inboxes to see what are the business operations that this team goes through on a regular basis. We then have everything that we need in order to strike precisely. We logged in to their main wire transfer application as a given member of this team, initiated a wire transfer out to an external account outside of the organization, which then sent an email to that user and to that user's manager to approve the wire transfer request that had been initiated. However, we had already established email filtering rules in their inbox to suppress those notifications because they contained particular keywords that we put in the description for this wire transfer. So those notification emails were sent directly to their junk mail folder, where we then deleted them. We then log into the manager's, or log in using the manager's account. From his perspective, he sees this queued wire transfer that's waiting for approval. We approve it. Again, it sends email notifications to both the approver and the initiator, and they're again suppressed, and that wire transfer goes out the door. So that's the type of very precise action that we're looking for that demonstrates that real-world impact. So concerns about this type of very broad scoping of the exercise. The first is around availability. I'll lose my job if you knock systems offline. And this is a very real concern and one of the most difficult to answer because we can never guarantee that that won't happen. We are operating from a zero-knowledge perspective, which makes it very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen when we click a button or execute a given command. The only real way to approach this is to minimize the risk involved here. So it goes to two components. First is recognizing that availability issues that are caused by the amount of traffic being sent to a system, such as systems that get knocked over by a vulnerability scan. That's not a concern in this case because we are never going to run a vulnerability scanner as part of this process. That's going to light up every detection solution that you have. So we're not going to be sending large amounts of traffic. However, we are going to be logged in as administrators to some of your most critical systems during business hours, while you're processing transactions, while the mine is operating. And at that point, it simply goes back to the experience of the members of this red team. And most of our red team members have 10 plus years of experience in some form of offensive security. So we're familiar with operating with that white glove approach in production environments during business hours. So in terms of responding to this concern, it's usually just a matter of walking them through the level of expertise on the team, but there really is nothing that we can do to guarantee that that will never happen. And we'll get into that a bit more in terms of the client communications. You do actually have to own the infrastructure or have authorization from the owner in order to attack it. So as more and more things move to the cloud, this is a discussion that needs to happen early in the chartering process of, if you want me to attack this business system, I need to know that you actually own the systems involved in this business process, or if you don't own it, that whoever does own it will allow us to attack their systems. Most established cloud providers have very routine procedures for this. You can go fill out a form for AWS or Azure or other similar providers that simply say, this is who we are, we're going to be attacking, here's the IP address that we're coming from. You lose a little bit of the zero notice component in that, but it's usually a compromise that needs to be made if you're going to target those systems. I mentioned that we want to avoid limiting the engagement to only those areas that the client thinks are important, because we find that there are often substantial trust relationships between areas that the client considers to be less important and their high-value assets. Along those lines, we want to avoid whitelisting in any particular subnets, though we will, when requested, blacklist certain systems. If there are systems that are so sensitive that they'll fall over from checking 5 ports to see if they're open, we don't want to touch those systems at all. And we'll just blacklist those, and that means that any attack chain that includes that system is just one that will not be able to test. We usually include, as a finding, client has systems on their network that cannot be adequately tested. This usually means that they're legacy systems that should, at a minimum, have some additional mitigating controls put around them to make them as inaccessible as possible. So on to rules of engagement. And again, this all focuses on maintaining that hyper-realism. We'll start at the top here with the red team autonomy. This means that the red team needs to have the ability to operate in an autonomous fashion without too specific oversight from the client. So the client is always going to be informed, a particular individual at the client's location who's serving as a primary point of contact will be informed of this operation and of the details as you go along. But you want to avoid a situation where the client needs to approve every step along the way. It causes the efficiency of the whole operation to just take a nosedive. Along those lines, we operate with a 24/7 window, meaning there is no restriction on when we can or cannot be continuing further in our attack. If the adversary can attack on Christmas Eve when you're operating your SOC with a skeleton crew of those who weren't senior enough to get Christmas Eve off to be with their families, then we can attack then too. And we've had clients who have explicitly requested, how much more would it cost to have you attack me on Christmas? Because they're concerned about exactly that. They know that the adversary is not going to take these times off. If anything, it's going to be the other way around. Access to and handling of sensitive data. We will have access to sensitive data as we go through this process. It's going to be PII, possibly EPHI, definitely material non-public information as we go along, depending on what we're targeting. There's various risk management processes around opportunities that Accenture has called the Client Data Protection Program. And when you go through this risk assessment process, one of the questions is, what types of data will you have access to, and how many records will you have access to? The only legitimate response is, how much does the client have? Because that's what we'll potentially have access to. And so it requires recognition of this fact in order for us to do this type of work. So if an employee at the client has personal files stored on their workstation, and your standard acceptable use agreement has said that you are using company resources and they may be monitored and so on, then that employee has authorized the organization to then turn around and authorize the red team to do this type of assessment, including accessing that workstation as part of the attack chain. So again, it's a concept that if you're used to thinking of this in terms of penetration testing, where once you get access to a system, you stop and you don't engage in the data mining, this is usually a paradigm shift for individuals within a security program who haven't really thought of it from this perspective before. But a lot of the value of this comes from the steps that you're able to take by data mining the data on the systems that you gain access to in this process. That gets into the additional question of how do you handle that? Because clients will have concerns, and we'll just jump over to those concerns here. You'll have access to everything, and I need to avoid a reportable incident. What's the difference between you having access to this and a real adversary having access to it? And so we'll establish some rules of engagement around access to that sensitive information. Usually the rule of thumb that we use is that the red team will only access or retrieve the minimum number of records necessary to demonstrate the impact of a given level of access. What that means is that if we gain access to a database containing 30 million PII records, we will then select the top 5 rows and see what are the types of data that are contained in this database, take a screenshot of that and redact that screenshot before including it in any forms of deliverable to the point that it's no longer personally identifiable. And then the other query that we'll run is a count of unique records. This means that we can then say, here's the type of data. It is indeed PII. It does have name, address, social security number, marital status, whatever. And there are 30 million such records in this database. We don't actually need to export the entire database and pull it back to our systems in order to do that analysis. So that is one of the most significant ways in which we'll manage the risk associated with having access to that data. We're looking to avoid any unrealistic limitation that impacts that hyperrealism. But clients will come up with all sorts of different requests for things that they don't want us to do, or things that, restrictions that they may place on us around the IP addresses that we're going to be coming from, notifying them before we do certain types of it, notifying the security operations team before we do certain types of attacks, and other things along those lines. When we go through that process, it's simply educating the client on, is this really something that you want to do? Are you sure you want to lose the hyperrealism focus here? And we've had clients that say, yes, I do need to limit it in this manner for this particular reason, and we'll work with them on that. But it's always done with the recognition that that is not as powerful an assessment in terms of driving improvement in the security program, because it is not as realistic of an attack simulation. And in particular, we're looking to avoid what we refer to as specific pre-approval hell, which is when a client wants to approve every exploit before you run it. So you find a system, you think there's a vulnerability there, you have to go reach out to your client contact and wait for a response back before you attempt to exploit it. That is one that we consider to be essentially non-negotiable, because if you require that level of granular pre-approval for every single item, it's no longer really an adversary simulation. It's more of a penetration test with handcuffs at that point. So finally, the communication and escalation plan. How do we communicate in a manner that helps answer the client's concerns about the availability impacts, data handling, and so on, but which maintains that hyperrealism? And the key component here is just restricting information on a need-to-know basis. Who in the client's organization has a true need to know? Usually it's their chief security executive, whoever that is. The CISO or the CIO, if the CISO reports to the CIO, often their chief legal counsel, and usually it's kept at that level. There are some times when the availability team is distinct and separate from the security operations team, and in those cases, sometimes the availability executive will be brought in, so whoever is keeping an eye on the system so that if anything goes wrong, they're able to very quickly come back to us and say, is this at all related to what you're doing? We are explicitly keeping SecOps in the dark. And even when a detection occurs, we do not inform SecOps that this is a drill. We don't tell them that this is an exercise. We let them attempt to respond to this as if it is a real attack. This results in some really interesting lessons learned that come out of these assessments that may be completely non-technical. So for example, we find a JBoss administration server that has weak credentials on it. Not quite default, but quite weak. We have access to the administration console. We upload an application file that gives us a backdoor, but this server is actually running semantic endpoint protection and detects this payload. It throws an alert in their security operations center, and a junior analyst pulls up that alert and is processing it through their queue, and it says that malware was detected, it was quarantined effectively. They closed the alert and moved on. 10 minutes later, we come back with a modified, more obfuscated payload, which gets past the endpoint protection, gives us a shell on this system, and then we use that as a pivot point to go further into the environment. And that was a key piece of our overall attack chain. That was a detection, but there was not a response there. What should have happened is that there should have been a level of human analysis that comes into play that says, Symantec found something here on this server. This means that there was something bad on this server. This is not even a file server, it's an application server. First, changes to this server should be rare. Second, if somebody has been able to put something malicious on this server, we have an active incident going on, and we need to declare this as an incident and initiate an incident response process. That didn't happen, and it was not in any way due to a lack of technical detection controls in the environment. So we want to be able to test that response effectiveness, but it can only be done if that information is kept on a need-to-know basis. So some of the concerns around this will be clients who say, well, I can't have my SOC tied up responding to this. What happens if we have a real incident and 2/3 of my SOC is focused on this fake incident? I understand the need to drill, but we also need to be able to prioritize effectively. And so we want to make sure that our primary point of contact in the organization is someone who has visibility into what the SOC is doing. What have they detected? What are they responding to? And what are the next steps in that response process? Without it being someone who is responsible for detecting and responding. So someone who has visibility but is not responsible for successful execution of that process. That's to avoid any potential conflict of interest there. Similarly, that gives them the ability to respond quickly if there is an availability impact by having that same individual keeping an eye on availability. So the way this normally works then is that we'll give this point of contact a list of IPs that we're using. And so if there's something that they see phoning home to an IP on the internet, they're able to correlate that without telling the operations team that they're even doing that correlation. Similarly, if it's something on the internal network, we're seeing odd behavior on application server XYZ. That point of contact will come back to our team and say, something odd is going on with application server XYZ. Is your team touching this in any way? And if the answer is yes, then we continue to monitor the situation, let the response run its course. If it's not, then that's more concerning, and that point of contact knows that they may have a real incident on their hand. But the process that the SOC takes to respond to it is not different in either case until it gets to the point where one of two things happens. One, the next step in the response process would have the SOC taking an action that would negatively impact the business. If they feel that a system is compromised and that system is part of a key business process and they want to pull it offline for imaging and forensic analysis, but that will impact the execution of that business process, that's a point when we'll call end of exercise, inform the SOC that this was a drill, and move on. The second item is if this incident escalates to the point where their next step in their response process would be to engage with external third parties, law enforcement, PR firms, and so on. That's something that we usually want to avoid as well, is having this potentially spin out of control outside of the organization. And so in those cases, we'll also declare end of exercise at that point. But we want to avoid the data leakage to the SOC team and any sort of premature termination of that exercise. So finally, a few guidelines for the actual execution of the assessment as we're going along. The first is to recognize that only an executive is going to have the strategic vision to have the authority and the confidence to approve this type of plan. And not all executives are going to be comfortable with this. It requires someone who is willing to, and who wants to know just how bad it is so that they can fix it. This can be, this concept and the potential implications of this type of an assessment can be very threatening to an executive who is responsible for the security of their organization. However, the executives who actually want to do this type of exercise will use this as a way to demonstrate that they have a higher level of assurance in the effectiveness of their security program, and will actually brag to their board saying, we know exactly how bad we are, and we're getting better. And we can measure that. We have a metric for the effectiveness of our security program. Here's our baseline from year one. We come back and do another assessment in year two and year three and so on, and we see it getting harder and harder to achieve this end objective without being detected and eradicated, because we're working to increase our prevention controls, to increase the time required for the adversary to achieve that objective, while at the same time increasing prevention and the detection and response controls to decrease the time required to detect and eradicate. At some point, those two cross, and when those cross, that means that the only way for the adversary to succeed a high percentage of the time is to increase their overall level of sophistication. If you force them to increase that level of sophistication and thus their level of investment in this attack far enough, it's either not going to be worth it for them to carry out this attack, or there are going to be easier targets to go after. That's the point that we want to help our clients get to. The only way to do this is to remember that technical compromise doesn't matter if you can't show business impact. This needs to be something that will be recognizable by executives who are not information security executives and not even information executives, something that is going to be accessible to the CEO and the CFO more than just the CISO and the CIO. So finally, be deliberate. I mentioned the risk reward for every action. Stay focused. Remember your OPSEC as you go through these engagements to have that resilience to attempted response procedures. Keep the objective in mind and be agile, adaptive, and opportunistic. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
So how do you, when there are clients that have specific periods of time during the year when they have sensitive operations going on, say, payroll and the business year, they're getting taxes ready, or they have, compliance thing coming up, you guys work around that, or you target for this specifically because it creates extra opportunities for you to kind of weed away?
It depends. It depends on the level of comfort that the client has with the degree of realism that we'd like to employ. Ideally, we will at most ignore it and possibly even attempt to use it to our advantage. So if we're doing something like a fraudulent wire transfer, and we can do that at a time when all of their invoices are being paid, and so there are a lot of wire transfers going out of the organization, we can use that to our advantage. Other questions? Yes?
So, how exactly do you guys go about showing metrics as far as, business impact, or security, and so forth? Do you have systems?
So we explicitly don't gauge our success by the number of vulnerabilities found or the number of systems compromised, because those are more IT metrics. Instead, we'll look at the impact of the access that we were able to achieve. So, for example, if we transfer $500,000 out of your organization over a dozen wire transfers spanning a 3-week period, that's a pretty strong indictment of the ability to prevent, detect, and respond to that. And in that case, that limit, or the reason we stopped at $500,000 was because that was established by our rules of engagement. So it's not hard to extrapolate the business impact from that. Similarly, we'll look at number of records compromised in terms of if the objective is data breach. Often we'll need to rely on the business as well. One moment. Often we will need to rely on the business as well, in that if we gain access to their M&A pipeline, including everyone that they're targeting to acquire in the next 6 months and how much they're willing to pay, that's hard for us to quantify without knowing their business very intimately. So we'll then go to the business and say, this is what we have. How bad would it be for you if this was published on the internet? So we will rely on them to some extent as well. All right, thank you. I'll be available up here for any other questions.
Under attack. For those of you interested in the demo party, that's going to start soon in the chill out room, so head over there. If you have not chilled out yet, it is the room at the end next to the doors going outside. If you're doing ham testing, that starts at 6 in the lockpicking village. If you have a hotel room, come see me in about 20 minutes, and I will give you a magic wristband, which gets you free booze at the cocktail hour, which starts at 7, which will be right here where all the vendors were. Banquet dinner starts at 8, so have fun until then, and I'll see you guys in a bit.